let's take a second to talk about decal materials and how to use them. So let's take a look at what decals are. So the first thing we're going to need to do is actually add a decal actor into a scene, and that's something that we're going to apply the material to. So if we come down to this quickly add option here, we type in decal, we'll notice that we have what are called decal actors. And if I add this to the scene, it's going to look really weird. And the first thing you're going to notice is that we have this volume. So anything within this green box will have this texture or this material projected down on the x-axis. And so if I slide it over my materials or my objects, you're noticing it's getting applied to all my meshes. The other thing you're noticing is that because it's projecting down, you're getting this big streak of a single color. Basically, the projection only happens in one direction. If I were to rotate this, let's say 90 degrees, you'll notice now it's happening in the opposite direction. I'm getting a kind of a streaking this way. So this is one thing to remember about decals. The other thing is we can size this down and kind of place it. And then again, depending on the thickness of our box, so if I thin this out on say just the one axis, I can kind of add information, let's say like a splatter or something else on a wall or a poster or something, where I want it to kind of go over in a more organic way. So cracks, blood splatters, mud, dirt, things like that are really useful to use with decals. And you can see here that this is just the temporary material. So let's go ahead and make our own material to plug into this decal actor. So I'm going to come to the content drawer here, and in my materials examples, I just have a folder called decals, but feel free to place it wherever you want. And I'm going to right click, make a material. I'm going to make this named m_decal01. And we're going to open this up. And one of the first things we need to do is change its surface domain. Because it's not actually solid, we want to change this to deferred decal. Deferred referring to it works with the deferred pipeline. Now, the other thing is, as soon as we change that, we're going to get an error. It says this can only be used with translucent, alpha composite, or modulate. So in the blend mode, you need to change this either to translucent, alpha composite, or modulate. So let's just go with translucent. And as soon as we do that, we see we have nothing here. And we have a few different options on the side. But the most important we're going to look at is the opacity. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to type in texture sample. And let's just come over to the details panel here. And let's find an alpha. And I'm going to use the checker pattern, the default alpha texture. This should just be inside the engine. If not, any kind of black-white texture will work. And let's plug that into opacity. And so the very first thing we're going to get is not much here. I'm going to apply. And then let's add a base color to see what's happening. So I'm just going to set this to red. And now we have a translucent material that's masked out to certain areas. And if I apply this and save, and then close this, what you'll notice is that we have created our material. Again, it's called mdecal_01. If I come back to my decal actor, which I can usually click on by this little card in it, and inside of the decal actor, we have a material slot. So I'm going to open this material slot up, and I'm going to type in decal because we named ours m_decal01, and I'm going to apply that. And you can see now that our decal actor has appeared with our opacity map intact. And we have a few different options for adjusting how that decal actor sorts itself. So if I have other decals, if I Control-C, Control-V, and I paste another one, sometimes we might want one to be on top and one on the other, so we can use that with sort order. You'll also have some of these fading. So as you notice, as it gets really thin to the surface, it kind of fades out. And this is to kind of allow us to kind of hide some of the artifacts from it. The other cool thing we can do with the material is that instead of hard coding the color like we did, where we set the color to red, we have this decal color option. And if I open this up and I try to set it to something else, it doesn't really work. But if we reopen by coming to our decal here, I'm just going to double click to open it. We can actually have a special node called decal color. So again, I right clicked and search for decal color. And this gives us an RGB value. I can just plug into the base color. And if we apply and save this, now what we can do is actually adjust the color of the decal from within the actual instance of the actor. So this could be really handy if we wanted to just be able to tweak the color a little bit or use it as a multiply over its base color. So again, this gives us some other order. This gives us some ability to decide. So again, I can change the sort order to move these up and down on top of each other. And this could be really handy to kind of add some interesting positions, so splatters, bullet holes, anything like that, where we want to dynamically change the material, and especially if we wanted to change it over multiple meshes. So if I came in here and just reset the rotation, let's say I wanted it to look like this was on the desk. So I'm going to bring it in here, I'm going to rotate it, I'm going to bring it down until it shows up on the desk. And now you can imagine that this almost looks like, because it's over top of the keyboard, it's overlaying on top of the mouse, the desk, we could look like we kind of like spilt something or we laid something on top. Now, you might be asking yourself, man, this is really annoying. Like some of these things I don't want this decal to be showing up on. And what we can do there is actually when we select a mesh, we can go to its details panel into the search option, and we can actually type in decal, and you'll see under rendering, receive decals is an option we can tick off. And so now the computer monitor isn't receiving the decal at all. Again, we should be careful about the size of our asset as much as we can be, but there might be instances where it's like, oh, actually, I really don't want that to happen. So again, I clicked on this glass, don't have decals. Again, I'm seeing it in the corner of this pot, don't receive decals. And we can kind of get rid of those artifacts that we might not be really wanting to see. So hopefully this gives you a nice high over view of how decal materials work, how we can apply them to our scene, and some of the use cases for them. So I'll see you guys in the next one. So let's talk about a pretty interesting type of material, and that is called a light function material. So let's look at how we would build that. So let's go in their content drawer, and I already made a folder called material domains examples. And I just have a file here called m_lightfunction01. So feel free to name it whatever and save wherever you want, but I just wanted to show you where I had it. And we're going to double click to open this. And the first thing we're going to notice about our material editor here is that we're going to need to change our material domain to light function. You might be asking yourself, well, where would I use this? I see it says light and it doesn't seem like it's doing anything. It's kind of glitchy. And really what's happening is that we can apply this material to a light and see the effect of that material on the casted light from that material. So let's just create a texture sampler here. And let's look for anything that is a black-white mask. Now, something we could do is use this AI spawn point or any other black-white mask. So let's just load this up. And we're going to plug this right into the emissive color. So what's going to happen now is that this black-white mask will augment how a light will cast onto surfaces. So let's save this. And then once this is done saving, we're going to come into our scene here. And I'm going to come up to the quick add and go to lights. And I'm going to use a spotlight. And once the spotlight has been created, I'm going to just set it over. So again, if you don't have this test scene, just put this into a default scene. Make sure that the light is touching the surfaces. And the thing we're going to look for here is for light function material. And it's actually under a category called light function. And once we've done that, we can now come and search for it. I'm going to type in light function because that's what I named my material. And what you'll notice is that we have this pretty subtle effect at first. But what I want you to notice is that if we move this over here and then we pull it down, notice that the shadow is now only in the white areas of the mask that we were feeding into the emissive on it. And why this can be handy is, let's say that you wanted a specific kind of like spotlight on a building, or you wanted a light that had some like weird fall off, like a gritty look to it. This could be a really good way to allow yourself to kind of control how that shadow gets created. And we could always crank up the attenuation radius and kind of control that, or we can set the inverse square fall off and turn that down a little bit to get it a little bit sharper. And this would also allow us to be able to augment the color just as you would expect. So again, a light function material is really used to augment the light position where it's going to cast out onto your materials. So hopefully you have a better understanding of what light functions are and how we can use them. Let's look at another type of material that is a little bit unique, and that is a volume material. And what volume materials allow us to do is kind of augment the volumetric fog system inside of Unreal. So let's take a look at what that means for us. Let's go to our content drawer, and I just made inside of a materials domain examples folder a material called m_volume01. Feel free to create this wherever you want. And once you have this created, we're going to open it up, and we're going to take a look at how we set this up. So the first thing we're going to need to do is under the materials domain, it is currently set to surface. We're going to be changing this to volume. As soon as we do that, we should get an error that says this must be an additive blend mode. So we'll go to blend mode, and we're going to set this to additive. At this point, our material basically disappears, and we get a few very basic pins. We get extinction, emission color, and albedo. Extinction is basically opacity in the context of volumes. So what we can do, for example, is I can just set a value of 1 to the extinction. And let's give this a color. So hold down the 3 key and left click. And we can come over here and just make it, let's say, red. And we've made a very basic volume texture. Now let's save this. And we're going to go actually apply this to a shape. So in your quick add to project, let's go to shapes and feel free to add either a cube or a sphere or a cylinder. So let's add this sphere. And we'll notice it doesn't do anything special for us. But if we go back to our content drawer and we drag our volume material onto it, it will take a second. And at first you'll notice it didn't do anything. It's just sitting here. It's what happened? It's invisible. Well, the one last thing we have to make sure we enable is that you have to make sure that you have an exponential height fog in your scene. And then also, once you're inside that, you need to scroll down to volumetric fog. Once we're there, we want to enable volumetric fog, and we'll see that our object has now appeared. Now, it isn't using the bounds of it because it is using the bounding box of our object to project it out. But this gives you a high-level idea of how this will start to work. What we could do now is scale or size our object here, and be able to kind of put down localized fog in a particular area, which can be very handy for particular rooms in a game where you might want it to be a little smoky or a little bit different. And again, if we want to control the opacity, we really are looking at that extinction value. So if I come back in here and just kind of pull this to the side, if we set this lower to say 0.2 and apply, you'll notice now after the shader compiles, we have a much more subtle kind of effect going on. So we only have this kind of fogging only in the bottom. So this again can be really great for building out other types of more advanced localized fog, as well as controlling the color of said fog so that we can kind of add a little bit more atmosphere or effect into our levels and our materials. So hopefully now you understand a little bit more about how to build volume materials inside of Unreal Engine 5. Let's take a quick look at post-process materials and how we can apply them. So sometimes we want to use a material, but over the entire image, or sometimes even within a certain area. But for now, let's keep it high level and just talk about post-process volumes. So let's go to the content drawer, and I've already made a material here called m_postprocess01. And again, feel free to save this wherever you want. I'm going to double click to open it. And the very first thing we're going to have to do is make sure that we switch our material domain to post-process. And once we do this, we're not going to see too much going on. But the one thing we will see is that we only have an emissive color pin. And if I were to just hold down the 3 key and make a constant 3 vector and say set this to red, and set this out to the emissive color, you'll notice now I don't see a preview. I'm seeing the entire screen rendered. So now I'm just seeing pure red. So if we want information to be fed in, because obviously we wouldn't want the game to be fully red unless that was the effect you were going for, was to fade the image to a solid color like this, what we can do is we can use a thing called a scene texture node. Scene texture. And the scene texture is an input type that allows us to actually get information for a lot of different things. So if we use this little drop down arrow here, we can actually come in here and pick the scene texture ID. And the ID that we're looking for, where there's a bunch of different ones, these basically give you access to all the different buffers, all the different images that we use to create the final image out in our game. But if we use the post-process input 01, we can do is we can actually, let's say we want to multiply this color versus this color here. And when we do the emission out, what we're going to notice is that if we apply and save this, let's see here. Okay, we have an error that we have to solve for. So again, the error right here is invalid input type, float 4, float 3. So the assumption is that on the A side, this has 4 components, and this one has 3 components. So we're going to fix that right now. And what we're going to do is, because this one has an alpha component and this one doesn't, what we can do is we can pull off the color node here and do a component mask. The component mask, again, allows us to just select which channels are going through and which ones are ignored. So we're just going to ignore the alpha and plug this in the A. Once we've done that, we actually can see what this has done. This has taken the information for the post-process volume and said, okay, take the final rendered image, and we want to multiply all that by red. And if I apply this and save, I might be asking, well, where do we save this material to? Like, how do we apply that to the scene? And what we're going to do is we're going to use a post-process volume. If you don't already have one in your stack, you can always come over to the quick add and type in post and use a post-process volume. But once we're inside of the post-process volume, we can actually search for just material. And under rendering features, you'll find a folder called post-process materials. Within there, you'll find an array. We're going to have to add an element. And then we're going to click on choose and then asset reference. What this will allow us to do is now come in here and search for our material, which I called mine post-process, m_post-process material 01. And what that's going to do is it's going to set it to everywhere, because my post-process bounds, unbounded, is set to infinite. So this effect will happen everywhere. Now, the other thing we can look at here is we can actually come back into this material here, this array, and we can weight it with other materials if we had them. So if we needed to fade between them, we could come in here and weight them. Obviously, this is on until it's completely off. So at 0, we can disable it, and anything above that will bring it back. So this is a nice way for us to be able to apply an effect to the whole screen. Let's say we had a particular moment or a level where we wanted it to feel kind of different or dreamy. This would be a really great way to do this. Post-process effects gives us a lot of different ways to affect our scene, because we have access to all those different buffers or images that create our scene. So hopefully you now have a high-level idea about how post-process volume materials work and how we apply them to see them in our scenes. So let's take a look at setting up a user interface material and what that means for us. So inside the content drawer here, I just made a little material already ahead of time called m_user interface 01. So feel free to make a material and save it wherever you want. I just happen to have mine in the materials domain examples folder. And I'm going to double click to open this up. And let's talk about setting up a material for a UI. So, and sometimes you want to have a material drive an image or a button or an effect inside of an UI. And UI is rendered slightly differently and has some different properties. So let's take a look at what that means for us. So if we come to the materials domain right here, and I go to user interface, you'll notice what we end up with is just final color and screen position. So we are allowed to kind of warp the vertices around, like kind of take a cube and kind of distort it, or we can just have a final color out. So let's just start by adding a texture sampler. Again, just left clicking to bring up our context menu, look for texture sample. And I'm going to do a quick example. I'm just going to look for some engine level content. You can add any image you want here. So there's just this cube 64, just a cube image. Doesn't really matter. So whatever you want in here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to multiply this by a color. So let's just take this and then hold down 3 on our keyboard, and while we left click, and we get a constant 3. And let's make the color of that constant 3 red. Now, to make this kind of like drive home a little bit more, we're gonna make this pulse a little bit. That way we can see what's actually happening here. So let's do a time node. And let's run the time mode into a sine, ending in an E, not S-I-G-N, but S-I-N-E. Sine node, and then we'll multiply the color here by a sine node. So again, sine is going from -1 to 1, -1 to 1, based on the fractional component of time. And let's plug this in, and so what should happen now is we should have this pulsing material. And so let's say, imagine in our UI, we wanted the ability to pulse when there's like a problem with a button or something like that. This is how we could build a material for a UI that is going to be applied. So let's look to see what that means. So let's apply and save our material. And so now that it's created, I just have created a widget blueprint here for the user interface. So if you right click, go to user interface, it should be on the bottom of your list, widget blueprint. You can create one yourself. And once we create this, we basically can have a mesh. So I'm going to delete that, and let's just add a border. And a border is just a container. And within this border, the thing we're looking for is the appearance, and it's called a brush. That's the only thing. And the brush is looking for an image. Now, the interesting part about the naming of this is that actually we can apply our material here. So let's go user interface. And you can see we have user interface 01. And now we actually have our material driving this image. So again, sometimes we don't just want to bring an image in to, let's say, our system. We want to be able to bring in a material that is changing colors and doing other things that we can then manipulate later. So hopefully this gives you a high-level understanding of user interface materials and how we can use them in a very basic way.